Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about open source sustainability for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How can we have more fun with JavaScript? Very excited to talk to our guests today. Before I introduce them, I want to make sure you know who I am. I'm Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone. Shouldn't be a surprise to those of you who are longtime listeners of this podcast. No other host today, so it's going to be a more intimate conversation, which is great. And I'm joined today by Qianqian Ye. And Qianqian, also known as Q, is calling in today from LA. Qianqian, how are you doing?
Hi, this is Qianqian. I also go by Q. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I'm very excited to talk to you today. I don't think we've had anyone on before from where you work or have worked. So you're currently on maternity leave, but previously you were one of the leaders of p5.js. You can probably describe it better than I can. What's your elevator pitch for what p5.js is?
So p5.js is an open source and art and education platform that prioritizes access and diversity in learning to code with over 5 million users. I myself actually learned how to code with p5.js many years ago.
So is it a tutorial system? Is it a workshop? How does it teach people how to code?
Yeah, so it is an open source software library, like JavaScript library. And it also comes with lots of documentation on how to get started with JavaScript and p5.js. And it's like a code sketchbook. So when you open a P5 editor online, you can just start to sketch your code. You can draw circles that follow your mouse. You can draw a paintbrush. You can create a pattern with like 10 lines of code. So I would say it is an open source software that was built by artists for artists in the beginning. And a lot of educators find it very intuitive to introduce that as an intro to coding for beginners, because it gives you very great visual feedback. And those visual feedback give you a great understanding of how the algorithm create those visuals.
Awesome. Now, Q, you're a Chinese artist, you're a creative technologist, you're an educator. You were originally trained as an architect, right? How did you end up with P5?
That's always like a long story. So I got my education in architecture and then later on landscape architecture. Then I was working in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and I couldn't help trying to learn more about what's going on in the tech world. I did a lot of work with VR at that time because I was very curious about how to designing or creating space in virtual reality. Then I tried to learn C# as a beginner, and that was hard. And then my partner introduced me to p5.js. They were like, have you heard about P5? I was like, no. And then I started to learn how to code through P5. I did the everyday-ish project. I started to push to GitHub daily because I really like to fill up screen squares. I feel like they are like little vegetable gardens that I like to fill. And then, I also post on social media about what I create as a beginner. At that time, one of Lauren Lee, who was a creator of p5.js, one of Lauren Lee's students, Shirley Jing, was trying to highlight Asian women and non-binary creator of p5.js on their website. So she reached out to me saying, like, can I showcase your P5 sketch on P5 homepage? At that time, I was a beginner and I was like, oh my God, of course, thank you. So I created a small P5 animation and then they showcased that on the website for a couple months. That was very empowering for me. And I was like, wow, this is like a very special community. They welcomed someone like me who's a beginner. And then slowly with other initiatives like translation and community organizing, I got to get to know more about the community. And around 2021, I became the lead of p5.js.
Amazing. So a lot of open source projects, when you start out, have a large technical hurdle. And it's difficult to get going because ultimately what you're building is something that does something really technical. I feel like P5 is a bit different. The product isn't necessarily the code, it's the art. The product is what you can do with it and how you can run with it and how you can make cool stuff and then share it. Do you feel like it's easier for projects like P5 to onboard new contributors like you? Like it was easier for you to get involved because it was more about fiddling around and making cool things and then having it be shown as opposed to having to fix things way down in the internals?
P5 project is very exciting because it creates a very beautiful art. It also has, those challenging technical parts that any open source JavaScript library would face. But I think for me, P5 opens doors to contributors like me and even like new learners because it's very fun to play. Like I said, when you open a P5 online editor that you don't need to download any code locally, the JavaScript file, it's called sketch.js. It's not called script.js. It was named sketch.js for a reason, to make people feel like they're sketching. That's from the learning to code perspective. And when it comes to contributing to p5.js, we have a lot of onboarding documentation. Documentation is, I think, the heartbeat of p5.js, in my opinion. I contributed to p5.js through translation first, and then later through code. A lot of our documentation also comes with like translations in many languages to lower the barrier for contributors to join the community. So providing that sort of documentation, I think, is essential to make contributors feel welcomed. And we rewrite and update the documentation constantly.
Talk to me about the community of p5.js. How many people, you said 5 million earlier, but how many people are in the community as a whole? Is it 5 million? Is it less?
The 5 million user is sort of like our rough account of like how many people register using, P5 editor online with some downloads. So users of p5.js includes contributors of p5.js, which is listed on our website and on the GitHub repository with the all contributor list. So I believe right now we should have around 700 to 800 contributors listed there. And we also overlap with the processing community a lot. So for folks who don't know about processing, it is a Java library that was created by Casey Reyes and Ben Fry many years ago. That was a library that inspired p5.js 14, 15 years ago. So just want to provide that context there.
So the Processing Foundation is a 501c3 that hosts P5 and other possible open source projects, right?
Yes.
If you were the lead for P5, did you sit in the foundation? Did you sit in P5? How did that work?
So p5.js is supported by the Processing Foundation. So the P5 lead were paid by the Processing Foundation. But p5.js is also a very independent project. So we can decide a lot of like the software directions within the community, of course, with the support from the foundation.
Fiscal hosting and foundational support varies widely over the open source ecosystem. Can you talk to me about the budget size and the amount of staff that you had for P5? What did that look like for you?
So for the P5 team, we have two leads. One is p5.js lead, which was my role. And so what I do daily is make sure, P5 library and P5 website is up and running, and P5 community events is being taken care of. Meanwhile, there's another P5 editor lead that take care of the P5 web editor. So we have these two leads from the P5 ecosystem that were supported by the Processing Foundation. And Processing Foundation itself comes with, executive director, program manager, and they also support, Processing Java project and other projects. Yeah.
So for the other 798 people who are contributors, how do they benefit from the Processing Foundation's work and from the two leads? Is it all volunteer?
I strongly believe that the volunteer-based model in open source is very problematic. And I've been trying to experiment different ways on how can we do things alternatively. So prior to my parental leave, I lead a project that was supported by the Sovereign Tech Agency. So they provided a significant amount of funding to p5.js, and all the funds goes to contributors. So at that time, we reach out to a lot of contributors who normally might not have the privilege to volunteer at that time. And we ask them if they want to learn to contribute to p5.js. And often it comes with mentors who we also pay stipend to. So in that project, that we got enough funding that we can distribute to contributors. And other than that, we also work with, Google Summer of Code, Google Season of Dogs, and some other initiatives that can provide support to onboard new contributors or invite seasoned contributor to come as a mentor. And I think a lot of contributors grow in this capacity. I see contributors who were new beginners, and then they stayed in the community and become mentors, and then start to become steward of certain area of p5.js. And then we invite them to become maintainer of p5.js as well.
I want to come back to something you said where the volunteer method of open source is problematic. Now, you have an essay that you've been working on. I believe it might turn into a book on civic media where you talk about care work in open source and how open source is working with people. Can you expand a bit about that?
So the book is about civic media that will be published later. It's a collection of essays from senior civic media fellows from the USC Annenberg Innovation Lab. So the essay that I contributed to is called Care Work in Open Source Software, reflecting my time on p5.js. So in that essay, I wrote about what different types of care work is like within an open source space. Open source software, when we thought about it, often appear as faceless, but there's so many people behind this open source software who have feelings and bodies, who feel burnout, who feel lost, who feel anxious. And so in that, I kind of discuss about like what are the care works that I've spending time to think about while leading P5.
Can you talk about what that care work looks like for you?
I think the care work can take different shapes at different times, in different scales for different people. I think one aspect of care work maybe we can start discussing could be decentralizing and decision-making the leadership model, because we kind of talked about that earlier. Like I mentioned, interested active contributors can take the role of stewards, and highly engaged stewards can become maintainers that can merge pull requests. p5.js was created by Lauren Lee McCarthy in 2013. And so after 7-8 years of leading this amazing library, Lauren decided to make space for others to lead. And I become the lead of p5.js when we entered this rotating leadership model. Since I started my maternity leave, we have a new P5 lead, Kit, who's doing amazing work stewarding the community. And I think it's very exciting to see like how new leaders bring their perspective to the community and to the project. Creators and maintainers of open source software inevitably, carry bias of their own when they maintain the software. So I think it's especially important to have diverse perspectives and to introduce new leaders in this space.
It sounds really easy on paper to me to just hand over to another person. Like, yeah, cool, I'm done now. You take over and you do that. But then there's always friction within the community. How is this person going to fit in our community? What bias are they going to bring? How does this affect my lead? How does it affect my role in the community that someone else is now over me or not, right? Hierarchies kind of exist in open source, even if they don't really exist. It's always kind of difficult. In P5, how do you allay these concerns? How do you work to make sure that the rotating model actually works for you and doesn't cause instability?
So when I started my leadership within p5.js, Lauren was my mentor. So Lauren mentored me through a significant period of time to make sure that I got a good hand of what it's like to be a lead of this software. And in my case, because of being a mother, that left me not enough time to mentor the next lead. I wrote a very long documentation to help the new lead to get started. And also my previous mentor, Candice Lim, stayed as the mentor for the upcoming lead to make sure the transition will go smooth. I hope that answered the question.
It does. It helps to have a transition of leadership, right? So you have someone who stays around for a while and says, hey, I can help you with that and complete that. What I'm more curious about is how do you do that through the community at scale, right? You mentioned translation earlier. That's one of the ways you got in. Often translations are kind of in their own little departments. For each language, there's like a group of people who work on that language. But then corralling them all together and making sure they have meetings and they're all aligned and figuring out which translations you're going to work on next. And also ensuring, say, that one language community doesn't feel left out of decision making because they can't sit at that table easily because maybe they speak a different language, right? Those are the sort of questions I was trying to figure out. With 5 million users, I feel like P5 is just totally freaking massive. And so I'm always curious with really large projects, how do you decentralize leadership without causing it to be so diluted that a leader can't actually do anything?
So during the time when I was a lead, we have stewards for different translations. So anyone can volunteer to be translation steward in the beginning. So for example, P5 officially support 4 languages on our website, simplified Chinese, Korean, Hindi, and Spanish. So we have translation stewards for these 4 languages, and their names are listed on the GitHub repository. When one of the big chunk of work that we supported through the Sovereign Tech Agency, Sovereign Tech Fund back then, was to fund contribution work. Circle back to volunteer model, like sometimes, a lot of contributors enter this space as volunteers. They are not coming for the money, they want to be part of the community. But I try to find a way to compensate them when we have the resource, because it's not like we have the resource all the time. But when we do, we'd like to highlight the contributor. We'd like to support them with the resource we have. Anyway, so circling back to the translation stewards. So we work with a translation group, came with stewards, and they recruit or they fund contributors, they fund translation contributors that work with that language. And we meet online and we share the same onboarding documentation. That was when we have like a big chunk of things that we need to update together. But translation in open source, I think, is another topic that I feel like could fill another episode. So I don't know if we have enough time to cover that.
That could fill a whole podcast. It's always interesting to me. I also haven't heard of many projects that have Hindi and Korean as their 4 languages. I would have expected Portuguese or French. That is super, super cool. I love
We
that.
do actually have community translation of Portuguese and French of our old website. So back then, we didn't include them as our official language yet because we don't have enough resource to support that. So we just encourage the contributor to translate them and then host them on their website, and we'll provide link.
Cool. Okay. When you talk about stewards, it sounds to me like you're giving some people an official role. Hey, you have a role in the group now. You are the steward. How do you ensure that those people don't take on too much work and they don't burn out?
We do update our steward list. Back when I was lead, I tried to update that. And I believe the new lead is trying to find their own system to update that. So after the steward has been listed on the issue for a while, we ask them, hey, we will update the list. Sign up if you still want to. Otherwise, the name will be removed. So I think setting up boundaries and reminding contributors to take a break sometime to avoid burnout is very essential for a care work. And speaking of setting boundaries, I'd like to mention that having to say no helped us to clear vision for the P5 project. In 2019, our P5 community made a collective decision that P5 will not add any new features except those that increase access. Access here means inclusion and accessibility. So when you go to P5 GitHub repository and open a new feature request, you'll be asked this question: how would this new feature increase access? You have to enter that question. And of course, a lot of contributors, they will request feature that answer that is related to access. But sometimes we do get new feature requests that has nothing to do with access, and we have to say no. And we do get like contributors who will be confused. It's like, why do you have to make your software so political? Or why don't you make your feature list as long as possible? Why are you saying no to this? Those are the questions that, help us to clear our vision and to make sure that within the limited capacity we have as lead, as maintainer, as stewards, we focus on the thing that matters most for the community.
Why is access the thing that matters most and not joy or something else?
I think joy is part of access, in my opinion.
Fair.
Access, can be defined in many different ways. And I mentioned earlier, P5 was initially created by Lauren Lee McCarthy in 2013 when they were very frustrated by the lack of diversity in open source space. She felt alone as a woman of color and wished for a space that was more welcoming to queer, trans women and people of color. And creating access to the open source software is essential. So speaking of joy, I believe it's on our newly updated definition of p5.js when you go to our homepage. Joy is part of the definition.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. I love that. I'm going to check that out right now. When you take new PRs, is there a committee that figures out whether something is accessible or not? How do you do that work? How do you make those decisions?
Yeah, so the contributor who fill the feature request form will need to fill the space about why this increased access. And then stewards, maintainers, or other community member can chime in to discuss. So for example, sometimes you might forget to answer that question and someone will be like, hey, you need to make sure that you answer this question so the community can help you reveal it. And sometimes when someone requests a new feature and lists some information about how this could increase access, it's great that some other folks will chime in and say, oh, this is great. And I also think this could increase access in this way. So that will really help us to understand feature through the access perspective.
Can you recall any incidents that were really difficult to deal with that were like this?
I do remember there were a few incidents, like the contributor who requests a feature wasn't happy about us have to include that access statement. It was very nice. Some other community member came in to explain why it matters and even provide some suggestion on how the feature that contributor asked could increase access in different way. So that was very heartwarming to see. In my 4-year tenure leading this, I feel like I'm still constantly learning how to address this issue because I'm not trained as an access expert. I'm just learning it while doing it. And in the 4 year of leading, I feel like I went to an access college.
So when you say you went to college, you're well informed about that, right? As well as having been the lead of Project P5, you're also an adjunct associate professor at USC Media Arts. And you've also been an NYU fellow and a senior civic media fellow at USC Annenberg Innovation Lab. So you're in academia in the art space, right? Doing cool, awesome stuff. When I think about art as a trade, I think about a lot of territorialism. A lot of artists are doing their own work and like, this is my work and my name's on it. And now it's in my, gallery, etc. But open source is very different, right? This is with P5 and with all these hundreds of other contributors. How does P5 balance the difference between the egotistical artist and having a whole community do the work with you? How did you build up the community in such a way that someone else was willing to come in and say, hey, that's not how we do things here? Is this a conflict that arises?
I would say that I like to point the readers to an essay that's written by Lauren McCarthy, the creator of p5.js code, Making p5.js. In the essay, Lauren mentioned that instead of I, they like to use we when they talk about p5.js. And I think that's what drew me closer to the community as well. I think often in open source space, there's this like lone genius myth. Think about the software or this project is created by one person. But I think Lauren made space for contributors to own their part of the project. And I felt like if it wasn't that mentality, I'm not sure I would be leading this project, and felt so welcomed by it in the beginning. In our contributor list, you can see that all contributors are listed. It's not through the amount of lines they contributed. It's not through how many issues they merged or created. Everyone is listed there without hierarchy. And I hope that sort of structure could provide, the community a glance of how this community is being presented as well.
I noticed you continually refer back to Lauren Lee McCarthy. And Lauren Lee McCarthy is great. Everyone should go check out her stuff. She's awesome. But I feel like that in itself is a norm that it seems to be something that P5 does really well. It says, hey, no, it's not me, it's these other people. What I wonder is, how do you help the open source community learn how to give credit to other people really well all the time? Because that's a learned process, right? It's not a given to say, oh, yeah, well, I'm just one people and all these other people are really great and I don't know what I'm doing. And so I'm just curious how you continue to do that besides having an all contributor bot and a wall of icons. Like, what do you do on a daily basis in the project to make it evident that we're all in this together and you should point to other people's work?
Like I said, recognizing and highlighting all type of contribution, no matter how seemingly small, is very important for P5 project. And in my opinion, it's a very big part of the care work. So besides code, we recognize and document all form of contribution that include making documentations, designing stuff for the P5, organizing events, using P5 for activism, and more. And all contributors, they are in our README and release note. And when I do the release, I like to use we, but because right now I'm no longer actively maintaining the project, that's why I refer back to I, because I don't want to speak for the new lead. Actually, I'm getting used to use the I part in this. When I do the release part, I often will have a part that gives shout out to contributors, especially for the first time contributors. And I will make a screenshot to make sure their names are in the social media post when we announce that. So I think having that sort of guiding documentation would help the community understand how we credit each other, how we treat different type of contributions.
I found it really difficult when I was the executive director of GNOME to use the word we a lot, because a lot of the work that I was doing was very individual work. It was trying to moderate other people's emotions, trying to make sure this bank statement was filed, trying to ensure that this budget was coming out. And I did that collaboratively with other people, right? I worked with Zana on the accounting. I worked with the board to deal with the board. But it was still a lot of like, this is what I need to do this week, and this is really hard for me. And I didn't have a huge amount of time. I was also on a contract, and so of course I didn't have a huge amount of time, but I didn't have time to get to know every single contributor, and I didn't have time to get to know every single member, even of my own staff. And it's difficult for me in open source projects to often feel like I have the time to get to know everyone who's relevant and to lift them all up by giving them the amount of attention and care that they need. Now, my sister is a chaplain, or was a chaplain before she went on maternity leave too. And chaplains are amazing people because they sit with people who are, dying often in hospital. She was in hospice care and tries to make them feel seen. And she was exhausted at the end of every day because that work is exhausting. Like when you say the word care work, in my head, that's what I think of. I think of hospice work, which isn't necessarily, I don't mean P5 is dying, but I mean the amount of emotional labor is really intense and hard. So when you say we try to mention every single contribution and we try to give everyone credit for their work, how do you stop that from leading to burnout for you on just an emotional level? How do you deal with the internal pressure of having to do your own things while also trying to lift everyone up?
Yeah. So when I first started leading p5.js, I thought I'd spend at least half of my time working on the code base. However, I soon realized that's not the case because I need to spend time working on grand applications for P5 events or P5 software updates. I need to have Zoom meetings with contributors. I need to have planning sessions with collaborators. I need to check ins with contributors who feel hurt, maybe in a conflict. So the amount of time, energy, and emotional labor spent on this non-code contribution is definitely overlooked by myself and often by the community. So at that time, I know that I need to set a boundary for myself and say no to things. It's important for this sort of care work. So I try to focus on what I think is most important for myself and for the project. It's hard to say no to things. There's no way I can do it all. And I will do the things that I can do within the time I have. I'm not trying to cover every aspect of what's happening within the community because that's merely impossible.
Do you have any tips for setting boundaries in ways that aren't brutal and hard?
I used to check GitHub every weekend, and I stopped doing that in the last year. And that has been good for my mental health. I did that with my friends. Like we check each other's GitHub green squares. If we see each other have green square weekend, we'll be like, what are you doing? Like, you shouldn't be doing that.
I love that. That's really good. I feel like those boundaries are just really hard to set. And I feel like it's really hard when you want to help everyone and you can't. Do you feel that being a new mother, I think this is your first child?
Yes.
Do you feel like that's helped you set boundaries in certain ways that you didn't have before?
I hope so. Like you said, I'm a new mother, so I'm still learning how to mother. So with the limited time I have, I really have to prioritize well. I have to prioritize things that can be realistic with the time I have. And I think that will really give me perspective later when I transition back to work full time again. I'd like to actually add something about what you said earlier about how can we make sure everyone is taken care of. There's no way that I myself, one person, can take care of everyone. So one thing I try to do when I was lead is to make sure I can empower others to care for others. Like stewards is a way for contributors to help new contributors. And we would like to invite folks to take ownership of certain things, and then they can cultivate their small group of folks that they can take care of. And what we can do is we can take care of the stewards, and then stewards take care more contributors, and contributors take care other contributors. So maybe that's a model. Could it be sustainable? We try to decentralize a lot of things, and decentralized decision-making will decentralize the amount of emotional labor as well in this process.
I like the idea of taking care of the people who then can take care of other people, like enabling that taxonomy of care instead of a hierarchy. That's excellent. It also frees you up for more time to do fun things. I know you went to the UN Open Source Week last year, which was cool. I think you're also going this year. I'll be there as well. The Open Source Week at the UN is another good example of the kind of things you can do if you have a project that's good enough to the point where you can take some time away to go talk about the large abstract stuff and know that the small stuff is still happening. You mentioned that you may be going on to other roles later. Do you have an idea for what you would like to do when you come out of the other side of maternity leave?
So prior to my leave, I served 4 years at p5.js at the Processing Foundation. I will be resuming working at the Processing Foundation as a manager of community and partnership. And this is the role that will cover community relationship building for P5 and the larger ecosystem. So going to the UN Open Source Week is going to be very essential for me to kick off that role as well, especially in the US with a lot of like withdrawals of National Endowment of Arts and grants from National Science Foundation. A lot of art and education nonprofits are having a hard time right now. So one thing I'd like to discuss with folks attending the Open Source Week is about like how can we have more sustainable fundings for open source projects, especially for the ones that will be supported by nonprofits.
The ultimate question. When you find an answer for that, let me know, because then I can stop making this podcast because it'll just be solved and we can just move on to do other things. Speaking of moving on to do other things, we are running up on time. Qianqian, this has been really great. It's been great to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people find more about you and your project, p5.js, on the web?
So p5js.org is the place where you can find P5. And if you want to find our work, it would be my name, qianqian-ye.com.
We'll have those in the show notes as well, which of course you can find on podcast.sustainoss.org. But don't leave yet. At the end of every episode, we have Spotlight. Spotlights where we highlight other people, projects, or things we think are really great. Traditionally, the host goes first. So my spotlight today is going to be Craig Maud's book, Things Become Other Things. It is a walking memoir. The Random House mass market book just came out. I have the hardcover here in my hand. I'm sure I've spotlighted Craig Maud before, MOD. Craig is like my favorite person. He walks in Japan and then writes about it. I don't know what else to say except that it's really amazing. This is the person who thinks really hard and works really hard to make sure that walking, photography, art, an understanding of rural areas, and an understanding of history all come together into beautiful books. That's his main goal. Do check out Craig Maud online and definitely buy this memoir. It has arrested me in my tracks, which is not really the point. I think I'm supposed to go for a walk now, but it's a really excellent book. So that is mine. Qianqian, what's yours?
I'd like to give spotlight to two amazing contributors in P5 community. One is Dave Pagorek, who has been steward of P5 WebGL and then turned P5 maintainer. Dave wrote an essay called P5 2.0 and an open source philosophy. I highly recommend you to give a read, and that will give you great understanding of what P5 2.0 is about and what the structure we're doing, enabling P5 2.0. And another contributor I like to give spotlight to is Kenneth Lim, who was my mentor when I was P5 lead. Kenneth wrote this essay called Designing an Add-on Library System for P5 2.0. So Dave and Kenneth and I were the core community member for the P5 2.0 project. It also comes with an advisory group that focuses on access. Without Dave and Kenneth, I don't think the P5 2.0 would go out so smoothly. Before my maternity leave, we worked on that project for around a year, and the P5 2.0 was recently released, which is very exciting, under the new stewardship of the new P5 lead kit.
Amazing. Thank you so much for highlighting those people and everyone else who also is part of P5. You can go to p5.js.org and see the all contributors list. And Qianqian, thank you so much for being the lead when you were the lead, and best of luck on maternity leave. Listeners, I hope you have enjoyed this podcast. If you have, there's a few things you can do. First off, this is a Maintainer Month GitHub sponsored podcast episode, even though it's coming out in June, because I was just a bit dilatory and we just have more than one a week. So thank you so much for coming on, and thank you GitHub for sponsoring this podcast. If you like this podcast, I would highly recommend sponsoring it. You can go to opencollective.com/sustainoss and donate. That would be really, really cool. Generally, each episode takes around $300 to produce, of which I see none of it. And it would be really, really awesome if we could have more podcasts coming out in the future. So you can do that. You can talk to your friends about it. You can talk to your bosses, your ex-partners, your children's children, and whoever you want to talk to, really. Just share the podcast. That'd be really, really cool. Sharing is caring. You can go to podcast.sustainoss.org to look at the show notes and see all the great links we had today. And you can go to all of our social medias on Mastodon and Blue Sky and LinkedIn, unfortunately, to share the podcast even there. That'd be really, really cool. You can also download it wherever, things are sold, and hit the like and subscribe button that's below in the link, except it's not below because this is not on YouTube. Besides that, if you have any thoughts about how I can make this final weird medicine commercial part of the podcast better, you can email me at richard@sustainoss.org or podcast@sustainoss.org. If you want to hit all the other hosts as well and suggest that any of them be on the podcast, you can do that too. And yeah, thoughts are always welcome. That's the end of my spiel. Thank you so much for listening. Qianqian, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been really great to have you here. I'm sorry for not pronouncing your name perfectly. I will have to practice more. But for now, best of luck in maternity leave, best of luck in the future, and hope to see you at UN Open Source Week.
See you. Thank you for having me.